Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is none other than Lord Howell of Guildford, who's been at the centre of politics for so many years, given that he was born in 1936, became a Member of Parliament in 1966, and has been a really major feature of particularly foreign affairs and energy in the House of Lords for a very long time. And David, you're still almost every debate on those two subjects, the eminence grise. You've been a friend and a great guidance to me over the years, and it's a real pleasure to have you here. David, where did it all start? I mean, you eventually went to Eton, but tell me about the Howell family history.
Yes, well, that wasn't really Eton at all. That in the old world of sort of subtle class divisions, there was Eton meant one thing, Harrow meant another, Winchester meant another, and so on. Now, my father was at Winchester, but he was a scholar. And he came from a family of military people, of overseas civil servants and diplomats, a long line of these who'd done all sorts of things in the government of India and Bengal and so on. And another uncle had been Viceroy, Foreign Secretary to the Viceroy of India, so there was a strong India connection. And anyway, what it meant was that these people had to be scholars because they didn't have any money. Mm-hmm. You didn't get rich in these services, except in experience. And therefore, he'd been around the world a bit. And he had gone to Winchester and he'd hated it, absolutely loathed it. Now, so roll forward 30, 40 years. He's got a son who's been at a prep school, one of the whole set of prep schools around Berkshire and Hampshire, most of which still exist. In fact, my grandson is at one of those now. And the question came, well, what do they do for a public school? That was the next stage. Enter my sister. My sister's older than me, extremely dynamic lady, deeply involved in the high life of London in the 1950s and 60s, with all sorts of people, of some reputations good and bad. I think the kingpin of it, in a way, was Tony Armstrong-Jones, because he went on to higher things.
And he became Lord Snowdon, married to Princess Margaret.
That's right, and had the son, Lord Lindley, whose shop is in Pimlico. So she said, oh, we can't have my brother going to Winchester. That's absolutely, look what it did to our father, and it's boring. And it's full of people some people who sort of pontificated and wrote books about the Labour Party, and we can't have that at all. She's got to go to Eton, that's the place, that's the swing. And so somehow in a trice, my prep school was entirely for Harrow, but I found myself on this track to Eton, tried to take a scholarship, failed, but the common entrance was considered good enough to get me into a house at Eton, and there I resided for 5 years. So that's how I got into the Eton stream. I didn't enjoy it very much. I wasn't very successful at Eton in the sort of glittering phases of best at field game. The organisation called POP, which was the ultimate elite, which people were allowed to wear sponge-bag trousers and decorated waistcoats. So I wasn't in that league at all, but I made some good friends there, and it was a very nice.
And of course, in the early governments and Thatcher years, there were a lot of old Etonians in the government.
Well, later on, yes, it's perfectly true. Well,
and many of them still your friends.
Yes, really the anti-Eton story goes back much long before Thatcher. When I was trying to become an MP, I was told, look, you'll never get in, chaps, because there's 3 reasons. One, you're not married, as I wasn't at the moment. It was just after the Vassal Tribunal, so the Tory party was alive with that scandal. 2...
and the Vassal affair, of course, was a private secretary working for the emperor called Galbraith,
Yes,
who was a Russian spy and was indeed gay, which was...
that was the thing that, the Tory selection committees of those days hadn't really adjusted to at all. So they didn't like that. They didn't like that I'd been working in the sort of intellectual centre of the Tory party, something called the Conservative Political Centre, and has taken over the job from a man called Peter Goldman, who just succeeded in spectacular loss of a Tory seat at Orpington. And they didn't like really that I'd been to Eton. And I was told for those three reasons, this is what was forecast, you won't make it. I was struck.
So did you? You were at King's Cambridge.
Yes.
And you read economics and did very well at that, and got a master's, etc. And then you went to join the Telegraph, or were you at the Conservative Party centre in between that?
No. Well, first of all, before King's Cambridge, I was national service, 2 years in the army. Somehow found myself in the Coldstream Guards. Don't ask me how, but it was a sort of place to be after Eton. Then I went to Cambridge after 2 years in the army, and then I went into the Treasury. Because
that was in 1960?
That's in 1959. Because Cambridge was stuffed with the apostles of Maynard Keynes, Austin Robinson, Joan Robinson, Hahn, all sorts of Maris, Caldor, long string. They were all the apostles of Keynes of various sorts. Some had gone.
This is John Maynard Keynes, the economist.
Yes, he'd been dead 10 years, but his spirit was round every corner, particularly in the college I was in, King's, of which he'd been the prophet of King's, and made them a lot of money too. So this was the world I was in, of economics and so on. And half these people had been in the Treasury or were advising the Treasury, and so I floated into an organisation called the what was it called? The Treasury Special Committee or something, which was actually a relic of Lord Keynes's private cabinet inside the Treasury.
So would you describe yourself as a disciple of Keynes?
Yes and no. Yes, to start with. Then as the world moved on, we suddenly realised that he'd been terrific in his time, and his recipes have been important for 1933, 1938, maybe post-war and so on. And he'd been right about Versailles, and that if we screwed the Germans, we would get another war out of them, which we did. So obviously a fascinating man. I tried to follow him by being... he'd been treasurer of the Cambridge Arts Theatre. So I decided that I needed to become Cambridge Arts Theatre treasurer, which I did for a time. And it was a lot of questions about collecting fees and money from all the brilliant young actors there, the people who later became, like Peter Cook, David Frost, that sort of generation. Getting money out of them was very tricky, actually.
But of course, Keynes was very much part of the Bloomsbury set.
Yes, he was.
And all the great art, great painters of that period. So, rolling forward, when did you join the Telegraph? Because you became a journalist, didn't you?
First I did a year and a half in the Treasury. Found I was getting nowhere at all. The whole team that I was part of was just seemed to be a sounding board for things they'd already done. We never had any influence on policy at all. And I became very tired of this. And I went off and I bought an Economist diary, looked at a list of the editors of all the papers in it, and started going to ring them up and say, could I come and see them and get offer a job? I went to the Times, where Maurice Green was deputy editor. He said, "You're much too political." No, I couldn't. No, not here, I'm afraid. Went to Gordon Newton at the Financial Times, and he said, well, he wasn't sure about it all. He was surrounded by brilliant people, and obviously I didn't qualify. Went along to Sir Colin Coote at the Daily Telegraph, who hardly looked up from his desk and said, "Very well, come in next Wednesday morning. I'll send you a letter about the fees." And then went on writing again. And
you wrote leaders, didn't you?
So I arrived and was immediately asked to write leaders, yeah, and features.
And it was such a good grounding for you, because you've written umpteen books on various things, and you write them very quickly. Yeah. I know, because I've been on the receiving end of them. And you sort of spend a summer writing a book, and out it comes. It's incredible.
Well, it's very much a training, I tell you what, to start with. I can remember the first night sitting there being told to produce 350 words on decimalisation by 7 o'clock deadlines. They went down to the stone, was the phrase, down to the printing works. And I could hear that clock ticking and sounding, and I just couldn't get ahead of it. It was awful. I didn't know how to write 350 words, even in 2 or 3 hours. Later on, you become very casual, and I could write it on my knee in the taxi on the way back from Parliament. But it's a real break-in. It's a real trick you have to work your way into. It's not an easy thing to do.
But nonetheless, you did. And you were at the Telegraph for 4 years?
I was at Telegraph 59, 60, 61. No, I think sort of 3 years, because at the end of that time, they came to me after the Peter Goldman debacle and said, now we need a new director of the CPC. And would you be it? And I went to see Lord Blakenham, who was the chair of the party. He was a very gentle, nice, bluff man. And he said, would I do it? And I said, yes. That meant taking over an entire floor of 32 Smith Square.
Which was then the Conservative headquarters.
Yes, the whole floor of it was devoted to the Conservative political centre, which itself, over and above the agents in every constituency, had 14 agents around the country who were all responsible for disseminating sort of monthly questions and dialogue and all sorts of ideas, and organising speeches and so on to keep the Conservative Party thinking about policy, which was that was my job.
Going back to the Cambridge days, did you ever come across the sort of spy intrigue? Was there ever any attempt to enlist you as a bright young...
No, I'd read that what happens is that a man in a Macintosh sidles up beside you and says, could we go out to lunch and so on, and you're being checked out. So I waited for it to happen to me. It never happened.
Well, so you say. You probably are the seventh man or something like that.
Just on one thing, though, when I did become a junior minister, immediately a man appeared in a Macintosh and said, we notice you've had lunch with the Czechoslovak ambassador. And this was when the height of the Cold War. And Minister, we suggest you don't have any other lunches with him. So they were on to me.
So, 1964, you ran in the unsuccessful seat of Dudley.
Yes.
That was your training. And
yes.
Then, despite all the advice you were given, the good people of Guildford realised that you were their star man and selected you. And in 66, you became their MP.
I did indeed.
And remained there for 31 years.
31 years.
That must be almost as long as anybody, I guess.
Yes, I think. Well, there were some longer ones, but that was an enormous era of change. I mean, Guildford was just ceasing to be a good old-fashioned market town with a cattle market and so on when I went there, and it was just on the verge of the high-tech era, and the university hadn't actually been started at all. There were still green fields, but I was involved, as were others, in getting it going. And all that turned the whole of Guildford into a sort of super high-tech industrial estate and high-tech estate system. And, of course, a major area of services of every conceivable kind. And near the airport and so on, very much a European place. And by the time I left, it was quite a different place, quite a different atmosphere.
And then started in, I think it was 1970, this sort of incredible ministerial career, because I think I'm right in saying you're the second longest serving minister in the history of government. I'm not sure who the first was, but let's suggest it was. I mean, it was roughly about 10 years that you were a minister in government.
More than that.
And it was, or even more, and it was, of course, brought to an end in a reshuffle, which was partly due to your then son-in-law, George Osborne, who was leading the party. But let's come to that later and start at the beginning. I mean, you became a parliamentary secretary in the Civil Service Department in 1970.
Yep.
And how did you how did the selectors...
there's a big story behind this, because before 1970, we had been working in opposition on what was called a new style of government. And this was broadly saying, look, it's 2/3 the way through the 20th century, We've had enough of half the economy being nationalised in gigantic industries which don't grow, they don't look after the customer, they're not investing, the whole place is stagnant. We've just got to inject a new dynamism into it when we, the Tories, get into power, which in 1970, of course, we did.
And this was Ted Heath?
That was Ted Heath. So we were really building up a colossal new picture of reforming the central
And who were the
government.
main thinkers at that time?
Well, there were... You're laughing because one of the drivers of chief critics was Ernie Marples, who would go around saying that all politicians were hopeless. The Conservative leadership was particularly hopeless. They didn't realise you've got to have business approach. And he'd built 300,000 houses for Harrow Macmillan and done this, that and the other. And unless we got a grip on the way government was organised and got a lot of bureaucracy out of it and got the people at the centre concentrating on strategy and policy and delegating all the...
How many times have you seen history repeating itself in your long period?
It's funny because only the other day we said split the Treasury, of course, because it was a gross block on our progress and on decisions and on long-term thinking. And of course that was defeated by the Knights, who all said impossible. And I just noticed the other day Francis Moore making the same recommendation 50 years later.
Yeah. But who are the main thinkers in the Heath administration in opposition?
Well, there weren't...
Marples.
Marples was the sort of, it's all wrong, they've got to have a business-like approach. I worked very closely with Mark Schreiber, who subsequently became a peer. It was under the title of Mark Malsford. We had a lot of younger men working with us as well, and younger women, in creating a sort of separate line of thought to the normal bureaucracy of the Conservative Research Department, the Conservative Central Office, and we're encouraged in this breakaway tendency, partly by Ted Heath himself, who always was very encouraging at every point, and partly by geniuses like Sir Michael Fraser, who was the sort of organiser of the party in the 1960s and 70s, and very carefully laid the foundations of subsequent victories by Heath, and then 10 years later Margaret Thatcher and so on. And he recognised the value of having these outriders. We were sort of rebels. In fact, we were rebels to the point of even raising our own funds, which didn't go down at all well with the fund managers of the Conservative Party.
And of course, all this thinking that was going on really came for naught because Heath was in and out of government, and you really couldn't get to grips with these things, with all the underlying issues.
No, but actually a lot more progress was made than you think, because Heath was ready to recognise the reorganisation of Whitehall departments. Our theory was that we had much policy at the centre, which would bring together environment, housing, all the geographical and arrangements and so on. We did away with the Ministry of Works, we did away with the Ministry of Employment, we created, of Labour, we created a new sort of employment ranging ministry, and all that was done, And furthermore, Heath agreed to setting up a real capability at the centre, which we wanted to be in Downing Street, to enable the Prime Minister to have a real say in all the departmental allocation of funds, which is why we wanted to split the Treasury. We were sitting on all this power, and we wanted to bring the Prime Minister into more control. Everyone cried out, centralisation, we can't have that. And it got sort of semi-defeated. They set up something called the Central Policy Review Staff. And we said it's got to be in 10 Downing Street. The Knights and the Mandarin said, I'm so sorry, it's got to be in the Cabinet Office through the green baize door at the end of the Cabinet room. Other side, and of course they won.
But through this, it was this very awkward time. What was Heath like to work with?
Before he was Prime Minister, excellent, very amusing, very sardonic. It had a sense of humour that not everybody understood. I mean, if he opened a comment with some interviewer, the first question, I suppose you've come to ask me a lot of boring questions, that sort of thing. And I remember going with him to the Sunday Times staff for a lunch. And his first question to some of the staff lined up was, why are you always writing inaccurate and fake articles? I suppose that's what you're doing all the time. And then shook with laughter. Whereas the chap listening to this didn't take it at all funny. He thought it was a gross insult. So the atmosphere soured from the start. His sense of humour was much too sardonic, much too refined for most people. But that's when he became... And then once he became Prime Minister, it was extraordinary how he sort of turned to wood. It sort of solidified. I can't find the right words. Victor Rothschild had some words which I'm not going to repeat on the microphone to describe what happened to him. He just sort of closed in on himself. The whole sparkle vanished. And
do you think it was a siege mentality that,
yes, I think it was
that often happens to prime ministers?
Yes, I think it was a bit. It happened to Margaret to some sense as well. But definitely things closed in, and his interest, which was in the before 1970s strong, in reforming the centre of government and creating a far more, and combining it with reform of the whole civil service, which I was deputed to do following the Fulton report. It all got distracted, really. We got lost in the muddy lanes of the manor in Ireland. We got lost in incomes policy. I remember going to see him one wintry day at Chequers, and he said gloomily, "I suppose they're going to push me into an incomes policy." And I said, "Well, don't be pushed, for God's sake, don't." But he was.
And your first love of energy and your knowledge of energies happened in 1974 when you became Minister of State.
Yes.
And who was your Secretary of State then?
Carrington, Peter Carrington.
And became a lifelong friend, of course.
Yes, he was a marvellous man and greatly enjoyable. His usual phrase about everything and everybody was, "They're all going mad, aren't they?"
I think I've heard you say that, funnily enough. And that's where your first interest in energy started, was it? Or
yes.
Had you been building up something?
Well, I didn't know very much, actually, before that at all, because it was a new department. There wasn't even a Department of Energy. So they had to create one with Peter Carrington as Secretary of State. Patrick Jenkins is one of the Ministers of State. I was the other one, and Peter Emery was the Parliamentary Secretary.
And you were grappling with, presumably, the crises that were starting to unravel.
Well, we were the North Sea, the OPEC, the first oil shock, and the second oil shock came on.
OPEC was the oil producers association, who were at one point holding the world to ransom with pricing.
Absolutely, and I kept on having meetings in an ex-church with Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani and Ali Khalifa al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti minister, they wanted me to tell Mrs. Thatcher we should join OPEC because the North Sea was opening up, thanks to my predecessor.
But this was when you were became Secretary of State.
Yes, that's later on. But I said I didn't think I'd get very far with Mrs. Thatcher and Britain joining OPEC. That was later on. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
No. When we formed it, we had the miners' strike threatening us. We had still dithering about nuclear power, which was running down even then. We had the first oil shock. What else did we have? I forget, really, the general inflation and so on.
Yeah, so it was a serious department with serious issues. And in fact, it became such when you became Secretary of State, rolling forward. Heath lost, Thatcher then came. You caught the selector's eye in their first cabinet in 1979?
Yes, I was a bit surprised about that.
Because you weren't really in tune with her way of thinking, were you? I mean, some people would have said you were a wet.
No, I wasn't a wet, you see. This is it. I remember I'd been head of her speechwriting team, in theory, which meant long nights in Flood Street, off Chelsea, off the King's Road, drafting up her speeches, and she would feed us some smoked salmon out of the refrigerator in large quantities. Actually, some of it was quite amusing because she had, contrary to popular myth and so on, she had quite a good sense for humour. And we got on very well. Writing the speeches was, of course, hell, because if you put a joke into it, she'd cross it out and say she didn't understand it. And she'd change things up to the very, very last moment when she was walking onto the platform for some big public meeting. But we rubbed along, and we did quite well. But I was there as her speechwriter person because she believed, and I believed, that we were all at one in seeing that we needed a completely new deal for the economy. We wanted to inject market forces and more enterprise. We wanted to push ahead with privatisation, which we'd started 9 years before with Heath, but it had all come to a halt. And she wanted to get on with the job.
And so, why were you surprised that she selected you to be Secretary of State for Energy? Because
yes,
you'd obviously been working closely with her.
No, I know, but I was surprised all the same.
Right. And you then walked into a storm, didn't you? Really?
Endless storms, yeah. Simultaneous. With all energy prices in those days were controlled because all energy came from the nationalised gas industry, the nationalised coal industry, the nationalised nuclear industry, and the nationalised electricity industry, which was the LCEGB and its regional boards. So, yes, I walked right in the middle of this, and it was extraordinary. And also, internationally, we had to try and keep OPEC from blowing up the world by pushing the price too high. We had to keep the Americans happy. I had to fly all around the world. It was an amazing portfolio. This is later on. The first bit we're talking about was the beginning of the 70s, 73 and 4. So it wasn't quite as powerful then. By the time I came back as Secretary of State for Energy, it was an enormous department. I remember Hugh Fraser saying...
Dealing with all the coal issues.
Yes,
absolutely. And things like that, and the miners' strike, etc.
Yeah.
And presumably you had to have some protection because you can't have been very popular with some of the policies.
They were extremely unpopular, especially when I allowed Sir Dennis Rook to put up the price of gas by 10% or something. They brought a real row in Parliament, motions of censure, and God knows what else.
And why did she then move you after a couple of years to transport?
I don't know. I mean,
because you were real, pegging a round hole in energy.
Yes, but I wasn't. I think she thought I wasn't getting on fast enough with denationalising the British National Oil Corporation, Tony Benn's creature. With all this participation oil, the state had a 50% say in every oil field in the North Sea. Anyway, perhaps she felt I wasn't. I think in a book later she wrote that I'd been too fond of seeing both sides of every question, which may have frustrated her. Anyway, to my surprise, she did move me to another department. I was actually in a tremendous battle with her and the whole cabinet then. I wanted to reorganise the North Sea gas industry into with a lot of new trunk routes with Dennis Hook, which would have saved us later on vast savings, but the Treasury wouldn't have it. The hardliners in the Treasury wouldn't have it, and she didn't have it. And so I said I wanted to leave this government, and she said, no, come back on Monday morning. I'm changing everything, and on Monday I'll give you another ministry, which was quite nice.
Which you did for a couple of years, yes. and then that was it.
And then she said, then came the election, and she was forming a new cabinet, and she called me in at night, not when the sort of queue in the Downing Street is happening, and said, I'm not going to give you a place in the new cabinet. You should go off and be the chairman of some committee or other. And I said, how do I do that? Ignorant. She said, well, I'm sure it'll work out, which of course it did. Such ordinary forces were at work behind the scenes, and I became chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where I stayed for 10 years. Yeah.
And came your great love of, obviously, international issues, which is coming around full circle in a way, because as you said earlier, your father and grandparents had been involved in working overseas and had great interest in that area. And now you, of course, are the go-to man, certainly in the Lords, on foreign affairs issues. You've been a great champion of the Commonwealth, and you've written A Mother of All Networks, which deals with these great strategic issues. Old Links, New Ties, another book you've written, which is about the Commonwealth again. And you've, as I said, been the go-to man at any debate or a speech on international issues.
Yes, it's more than the Commonwealth, really. It's really, here we are repositioning ourselves in a completely changed world with all the power in Asia and moving away from the West. In fact, is there something called the West anymore? I'm not sure there is. And we have these connections which a lot of them come from the Empire, but a lot come from countries simply wishing to, rather admiring the British system, believing in the rule of law and democracy of a kind and so on, and wanting to be finding a safe haven in a very dangerous world. So it's really repositioning Britain. How do we cope when we aren't even the hub of anything anymore? We're just part of a vast network of pinpoints of relationships. And we can make our contribution, but we have to do it in entirely new ways, and that's my battle now.
And do you see history repeating itself again as we go into a post-COVID, post-Brexit mire, where we're no longer a competitive nation, where we're spending more than we're earning in terms of tax, where there's a big state which is sort of seemingly out of control? Do you see that at some point there's going to be we're going to have to draw a line in the sand, or do you just see it going relentlessly?
No, I think there is a new order emerging through the mist, but I don't see any repeating of history, because half my political career was before the digital age, and the second half has been in the digital age. And the digital age, every relationship, even in the family, between politicians, between governments, between nations, between business, is changed. It's altered by connectivity and instant communication. And that transfers, that means only comparisons, even now with the Thatcher time, are really not much use. There were certain qualities that one can try and copy, but basically in the digital age, everything is altered. All relationships are altered, from the very humblest at school or in the family, right up to the international scene. And that message, again, hasn't quite got through to a lot of people, but it will. It will.
Well, next year you start your 88th year, which is, you're as fit as a butcher's dog. I've never seen a man move around with so much energy. And it's one of the wonderful blends of the House of Lords is that this, the whole knowledge that you bring to the equation, vast knowledge in your case. And David, it's been a great pleasure hearing all this. But in particular, thank you very much for all the support and help you've given me as a sort of father figure in the Lords.
Well, thank you for listening to my sometimes rather boring views, and my hope would be that everything I can give you and the next generation and the generation after that to get this country really repositioned in the new international order, I shall give.
Thanks very much.